Good afternoon. I want to thank you all for joining us here at the Race, Wealth, and Homeownership Conference. Welcome to our second session titled National Models. I'm Alana Ballard of Housing Opportunities Made Equal, also known as HOME, and I'm delighted to be the moderator for this panel. And I want to thank Zillow for sponsoring this portion of the event. For those of you not familiar with HOME, we're an organization that has, for more than 50 years, worked to eliminate unlawful housing discrimination in the greater Cincinnati area, ultimately promoting stable, integrated communities. And during this panel, we have some questions for you, the viewer, today. And when you see the poll to your right, it really helps us out if you can answer the questions. And if you have questions for us, feel free to put them in the chat. So as our previous panelists have mentioned, the Black homeownership rate is lagging far behind compared to their white counterparts. And we're looking at solutions today to remedy that. And we know some of this is due to historic discriminatory practices like redlining. And I'm a Cincinnati native, so I have a mother from Madisonville, a historically redlined community, and a father from the West End who knew in 1979 that Kennedy Heights would be a place they could buy their first home because it was built as a community that was welcoming to all. But not all neighborhoods did that in Cincinnati. So today we're going to look at some national and local initiatives to advance wealth. And our panelists today include Luke Bell, Senior Manager, Government Relations and Public Affairs, Midwest Region for Zillow, Lori Benner, Associate Vice President of Programs, National Fair Housing Alliance, and Janice Jones, Executive Director of HOME. And so we'll go ahead and start with Luke. So take it away.
All right. Thank you, Alana. And thank you, everybody, for having me here today. Really appreciate the opportunity to participate in this very important conversation. So I work, as Alana said, I work on the state and local government relations and public affairs team at Zillow. And basically, one of my jobs is to connect and work with elected officials and important stakeholders in the Midwest region on issues like this. Basically, 16 years ago, Zillow was founded with a very simple goal, which was to empower consumers with more and better information about the housing market, to bring transparency to what was otherwise kind of an opaque home buying and real estate process. So fast forward today to where we have roughly 229 million monthly active users using our platform to move to life's next chapter. Our overriding mission as part of this is to inform. It's really to turn on the lights on what's happening in the housing market and shed some light on disparities and inequities that we see. Our overriding mission is to unlock life's next chapter for our customers, but unfortunately, that goal remains out of reach, as we will see, and disproportionately so for Black and Latinx homeowners. So my presentation just kind of focuses, as you see on slide 1, focuses in general on what's happening with Black homeownership in America and Cincinnati specifically. Some of the panelists on the first panel really drove this point home, but I'm just going to back it up with a little bit more data. But both nationally and in the Cincinnati region, there is an enormous and widening gap in household wealth between Black and white households. And instead of making progress in closing this gap, instead, this gap has only widened since the Great Recession, especially in Cincinnati, as I will point out. So our economic research team, using Federal Reserve data, showed that there is a $3 trillion wealth gap in America between Black and white households. Almost 40% of this gap, about $1.2 trillion, can be attributed to housing factors. Breaking that down a bit, that works out to about $174,000 per household. The typical Black household has less than 1/4 of the wealth of a typical white household in America. That's down from about a third, 35% before the Great Recession. Nationwide, Black-owned homes are worth typically about 18% less than white-owned homes. And the Black homeownership rate is just 42% compared to 72% for white households. And now kind of moving forward into slide 3, which is the data in Cincinnati itself. So if Black housing in America looked like white housing with comparable home ownership rates and home values, Black household wealth would be more than double what it is currently today. It'd be about 2.1 trillion compared to about $930 billion, which it is today. In the Cincinnati region, the Black homeownership rate is currently just 33%. That's a 40% gap compared to the white homeownership rate of 73%. Just want to point out that this gap in the homeownership rate is almost a third larger than the national homeownership rate gap. Also, just want to point out that while the Black homeownership rate went up by about 0.5%, 0.5% between 2018 and 2019, the Black homeownership rate actually shrunk in Cincinnati by 1.7% over the same time. So it is a problem that is actually getting worse in Cincinnati rather than getting better. So the value of a typical Black-owned home in Cincinnati is $175,000, which again is 18% lower than the average value of a typical white-owned home. So when you look at this, housing will be a prominent factor, if not the most prominent, as we move forward over the next decade in determining whether or not we're able to close this racial wealth gap between Black and white households. So as part of this study, we looked at basically 5 different scenarios. This is on slides 4 and 5 of my presentation. Looked at 5 different scenarios, basically looking at what could happen potentially with the wealth gap over the next 10 years. These scenarios range from the more optimistic to the more pessimistic. Under the most likely scenario, we think Black home values will grow 5% faster than the average home value appreciation. And we think Black home ownership rates will grow about 0.5% per year over the next 10 years. We would call this scenario somewhat optimistic. And even under this very optimistic scenario, it would take until the year 2183 for Black households to reach housing parity with white households. So just to emphasize that point, no one alive today or their children would get to live in an America with racial housing equality under the status quo. So it's abundantly clear that this problem is not going to solve itself, and it's not going to go away naturally or quickly with normal market appreciation. The problems run deep. They feed back against each other, which only perpetuates the inequality. So unfortunately, we're going to need intentional, targeted, and dedicated policy to repair this fundamentally broken and discriminatory system. To close out, I just want to emphasize a few things that the previous panelists mentioned in terms of what factors have led to this large structural gap. We can't talk about how to address these problems without talking about what partially created these problems in the first place. And that discussion, of course, always begins with redlining. Unfortunately, redlining's successor in perpetuating housing disparities is single-family zoning. If you look at the nation's 50 largest metro areas, neighborhoods that are made up of mostly single-family detached homes are whiter, and they are more racially segregated than the city as a whole. The simple fact is that households headed by a person of color are less likely to live in areas where single-family detached homes represent the bulk of the housing stock. In Cincinnati specifically, while 80% of the population of the metro area is white, the average single-family zoned neighborhood is almost 90% white. So housing units in duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, other types of multifamily unit buildings are more affordable and likely then more accessible for groups that may likely be able to afford less. They don't have access to the intergenerational wealth that white households do. We call these housing units the missing middle, and creating more opportunities for Black homeowners, potential Black homeowners, is going to require more of these missing middle housing opportunities. So according to information compiled by LISC Cincinnati, one of our previous panelists, over 77% of the residential land within the city of Cincinnati itself is zoned exclusively for single-family detached housing. Many other communities in the suburbs have even higher percentages than that. So as the Cincinnati Regional Chamber, as LISC Cincinnati and other groups are working on, we do need to reform zoning laws to allow more density. I know that density discussions are difficult at the local level. It brings in a lot of NIMBY concerns, but increasing density doesn't have to be drastic. We have a research report it's called modest densification. And we demonstrate that even just allowing increased density on 1 out of every 10 current single-family zone lots over the next 20 years could create an additional 2 million housing units in America. Most of these units would be affordable and thus accessible to potential Black homeowners. So there's a lot of interesting discussions happening. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. We don't have all the solutions. It's going to take a lot of collaboration. And I'm looking forward to what Janice and Lori have to say and to see how we can help be part of this solution. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Luke. Now I have a few questions. So Zillow has done extensive research in the various aspects of homeownership. Tell us a little more about Zillow Research and why Zillow does this work.
Thank you, Alana. So as I mentioned, Zillow's the main focus of the website is to basically turn on the lights. It's to call attention to issues and things we see in the housing market in terms of disparities and equities. So we have a full team of basically economists, research professionals, whose sole job is to put out research reports of this nature. They're always accessible on Zillow.com/research. Most of those reports you can actually sort and get local data. For example, on Cincinnati, most of the reports are sortable. So in addition to, the Black homeownership and wealth report that I mentioned today, we have a modest densification report, which talks about zoning reform. We have a Latinx wealth and homeownership reports, because unfortunately, this problem is not unique to the Black community. It is more pronounced in the Black community. But of course, Latinx homeowners also have issues accessing wealth in America as well. And then we have a lot of reports on, frankly, we're not building enough housing units, on building permit shortfalls and housing construction shortfalls. So we do this work because we care about housing equity, and it's something we think is important. But I think, as you can see from the numbers I presented today, everyone should care about closing the Black wealth and homeownership gap, because there is a large pool of untapped wealth in America. You have a large number of Americans who are being held back from accessing opportunity. And if they were allowed to access opportunity at the same rate as the rest of America, we think it would unleash vast economic potential.
And that kind of answered my second question when you're talking about your research in the Latinx community in the same areas. So it looks like Cincinnati kind of got a bad report card there when it comes to the home ownership gap. And why do you think that is?
Yeah, so, of the 59 or 58 municipalities we looked at for the Black home ownership and wealth research, Cincinnati, unfortunately, was the third worst in terms of the disparity between white and Black households. And I think a lot of the previous presenters touched on this, but when we look at some of the underlying factors that account for this, a lot of it is the percentage of land that is in single family zoning, the proportion of the housing stock that is more affordable compared to, let's say, single family detached zoning. There's a lot of issues that go into that, but I think as we talk about, one of the things I didn't even mention in the presentation, which a lot of other presenters I know will touch on, is access to credit. And if you are, unfortunately, a Black individual in Cincinnati compared to a white individual, you are more than twice as likely to be denied access to a mortgage loan. So we think if you look at the two main factors, it's zoning reform and the need for zoning reform, and it is basically lack of access to credit.
Well, thank you so much, Luke. Is there anything you wanted to add before we move on to Lori?
No, thank you. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, Lori is up next. And before she gets started, I just want to remind you once again to click that poll tab and take our poll. And if you have anything to add in the chat about something you might do in your work or in your neighborhood to help promote stable integrated communities, please let us know in the chat. All right. So next up, we have Lori Benner. Go ahead. Stage is yours.
Thanks so much, Alana. I appreciate you all including me today. I am Lori Benner. I'm the Associate Vice President of Programs for the National Fair Housing Alliance, and I've been asked to present today on the history of housing and how it impacts Black wealth and national initiatives and programs centered on Black homeownership. Next slide, please. NAFA is a 33-year-old nonprofit civil rights organization that works to eliminate housing discrimination and to ensure equal opportunity through leadership, education, outreach, membership services, public policy initiatives, community development, advocacy, and enforcement. We also serve as a trade association for fair housing centers across the U.S. Housing is at the center of our lives, and fair housing is the very heart of NAFA. Next slide, please. Where you live matters. From the real estate industry perspective, we tend to think of fair housing through an almost exclusively discrimination-focused lens. But at NAFA, we consider fair housing to be a broader civil rights issue. When people are offered equitable resources and opportunities to secure safe and affordable housing, they have boundless possibilities. This outcome isn't just good for the individuals themselves, but for all of us. Communities are stronger and healthier when they're more equitable. Opportunity, or lack thereof, determines where people live, and where people live determines their access to technology, healthcare, education, transportation, employment, and it further determines personal and family wealth. Fair housing has implications beyond just discrimination and housing opportunity. Those also disproportionately impact Black and Brown communities, and it can also determine health and wealth. It's been shown that one's childhood zip code is the best predictor of adult success. Next slide, please. So racial homeownership trends tend to be a touchy subject for a lot of people. I'm sure all of us have seen in comments in social media or in platforms, conferences, events just like this, people getting upset when we discuss race. And I don't necessarily mean upset about the injustice. I mean upset because they deny that racism exists or feel that they're being personally blamed for the racial ills of today's society. That's why continuing to highlight historical education is so important. In order to understand how we got here in the first place, we need to know that history. So I'll touch on some of those items throughout my presentation. Now, you may ask yourself, now that we're more than 50 years past the height of the civil rights movement, how do these disparities remain? The answer is through decades of government-created laws and government-created laws and policies designed to segregate, discriminate, and deny opportunity to people of color. The Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, was created in 1933 in the midst of the Great Depression to protect homeowners from losing their homes. The agency purchased mortgages that were facing foreclosure and issued new mortgages with longer repayment periods, and for the first time ever, offered an amortized schedule so buyers could gain equity as they paid off the loan. To depict the level of risk in these different communities and neighborhoods, HOLC created a series of multicolored residential maps for 239 cities across the nation. Although Cincinnati's hasn't been digitized, the map you see here on the slide is an approximation based on 1930s census data. HOLC assigned communities rating from A through D to designate levels of risk in an investment. Neighborhoods that were all white were given an A rating and colored green and denoted as the best area for investment. Meanwhile, if a single Black family lived in an area, regardless of the income level, it was automatically assigned a D to indicate a hazardous investment area, and it was colored in red, hence the term redlining. Now, neighborhoods that were assigned D and C categories were usually communities where immigrants or their children lived. So soon after that, the newly created Federal Housing Administration, or FHA, used these maps in their own lending practices. Possibly even more insulting was the fact that Black military veterans were denied use of benefits to purchase homes. Another common practice at that time that was used to keep the quote unquote integrity of a neighborhood was the use of restrictive covenants. These were written provisions in home deeds and community documents that explicitly forbid selling to certain kinds of people, usually Black and foreign-born people. Although illegal, these provisions remain in documents all over the country. I can't even imagine buying a home and seeing a clause in the deed that formerly prohibited me from buying there. I think that would be really heartbreaking. And I know that there are efforts being taken across the country to remove those types of clauses from those deeds moving forward. So in addition to all of that, Black real estate agents were not allowed to join the National Association of Realtors, and NAR staunchly opposed efforts to integrate neighborhoods and even fought against the passage of the Fair Housing Act. So although these policies are decades old, inequality still lingers. The systemic infrastructure designed to perpetuate racial inequality has had lasting effects, and generational wealth has been lost, generational support for homeownership, and a well-earned overarching distrust of housing professionals and lending institutions has created more barriers. In fact, the crushing student loan debt that disproportionately impacts Black individuals is tied to the absence of generational wealth. Next slide, please. The racial composition of this country is changing exponentially. It's predicted that in the next 20 years, there will be no racial majority in this country. The racial homeownership gap, as we heard, is significant, and it's directly related to the wealth gap. White households have 10 times the wealth of Black households and 8 times the wealth of Latinx households. Of course, it's not just an ownership gap, but a home value gap. It's been well documented, such as in the book Race for Profit, how properties in white hands are valued more than properties in Black hands. Homes owned by Black individuals do not accrue value at the same rate and often function as a debt burden. NAFA's CEO, Lisa Rice, tells a story about how her parents in Toledo, Ohio, attempted to buy a home when she was a baby, but they weren't allowed to buy in a certain neighborhood where they wanted. So they settled for a comparable home in a neighborhood where Blacks were allowed to buy. So flash forward decades later, and the home that they originally wanted to buy is worth about $350,000, while the home they were allowed to buy is worth less than half of that. Now, this story plays out for millions of families all across the country who were denied the opportunity to accumulate wealth that could be used for education, starting a business, or helping family members buy a home of their own. Next slide, please. Luke kind of touched on this in his remarks, but another area where there's a large gap is in credit. You can see here that only 25% of Black individuals in the US have a credit score of over 700. The number is much lower in many areas. A recent study that NAFA did in partnership with Zillow determined that majority Black and Latinx neighborhoods have far less access to traditional financial institutions and far greater numbers of alternative financial institutions such as check cashing establishments and payday lenders. These businesses often charge exorbitant interest rates or impose onerous repayment terms that put borrowers at risk and put them at a disadvantage from the start and contribute to defaults, poor credit scores, and other debilitating outcomes. So it makes some sense that even in the presence of traditional financial institutions, the higher rate of credit insecurity among Black and Latinx Americans means that they're denied mortgages at higher rates by the country's largest lending institutions. It also makes sense that consumers of color are more likely to be credit invisible than their white counterparts. In fact, banks are closing branches at higher rates in affluent Black areas than they are in poor white ones. And this is a ripple effect to this ongoing discrimination. Lower home values equates to lower property taxes, which in turn impacts school funding. Poor educational opportunities are tied to higher rates of incarceration and lower levels of future employment and household income. And overall, this community disinvestment depresses areas economically and socially. It creates poor health incomes, And it's, a lot of these practices are kind of being termed as modern day redlining. Next slide, please. So now, probably more than ever, there's a spotlight being brightly shown on racial inequities. And it's important that we keep the momentum going and not let this just be a moment. For our part, the National Fair Housing Alliance developed a 3-year, 10-city initiative called Keys Unlock Dreams. So I'll keep moving here with our technical difficulty. So the Keys Unlock Dreams initiative has 5 overarching goals, and those are to remove structural barriers that perpetuate racial inequality, to oh goodness. Sorry, I got distracted there. Yeah, so to perpetuate racial inequality, removing those structural barriers, to support and expand affordable and fair housing options, to prevent an unbalanced recovery from the COVID pandemic, to provide consumers and stakeholders, our partners, with critical information and resources. And more than anything else, the heart of this initiative is to help close the racial wealth and homeownership gaps. Next slide, please. So the 5 initiative components are research, advocacy and policy, programs and products, education and outreach, and partnerships. As for research, we're partnering with Zillow and the Urban Institute to do a deep dive in each of our key cities. In the Zillow research I mentioned earlier, we examined the 10 Keys Unlock Dreams metro areas for community disparities related to financial services, healthy food access, and fitness and outdoor recreation amenities. You might not be surprised to hear that non-white areas had far less access than white areas in all of these categories. Our research reports will focus on the racial homeownership gap and home value gaps, and home price trends, housing supply, credit score data, and use of HUD housing choice vouchers. We'll also be evaluating each city's assessments of fair housing or analysis of impediments to fair housing, and the community health needs assessments. Both documents will help inform advocacy and policy work. So those documents also are done through stakeholder and public input process to evaluate current housing or health metrics and set out goals for future efforts. So those aspects, connecting the health and housing, as we've seen during this pandemic, how intrinsically related those 2 items are. So for the programs and products, we want to focus, those are largely consumer focused, and we want prospective home buyers to be prepared, confident, and educated about the home buying process. Finally, this entire effort is based on partnerships. Keys Unlock Dreams is going to help lift up the goals and aspirations of our partners so we can all lock arms and move together in tandem. Next slide, please. So our main cities that we're going to be in are here: Columbus, Ohio, Detroit, Michigan, Memphis, Tennessee, Atlanta, Baltimore, Houston, New Orleans, Oakland, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. And we are open to and exploring other areas of the country as the need arrives, and we develop strong partnerships in those areas. So that concludes my remarks, and I really appreciate, again, you having me participate today.
Thank you so much, Lori. And it's so nice that NAFA has taken the lead on this for decades. What are some of the other hot topics affecting housing opportunities for Black prospective homebuyers?
Oh, that's a good one. And I do think that Luke, again, he touched on this. It really has to do with credit and with financial access. The mortgage denials are a much higher rate for Black individuals than for white individuals. Discriminatory lending is prominent. Black homeowners have been found to hold subprime loans at a much higher rate than white individuals. Racial steering is another. Studies have found that it's still widespread, unfortunately, in the housing market. Lower appraisals, that's a big issue that's being focused on right now. And predatory and unfair lending practices. So again, those are the things that we're kind of calling modern day redlining, because the efforts that have been introduced just aren't being advanced and enforced as good as they should be.
And my last question for you, what are some of the similarities of those cities that you chose to participate in the Keys Unlock Dreams initiative?
Yeah, so those cities are all ones that they have high racial homeownership gaps and other housing related challenges. Also, the cities all have strong networks of housing related entities to help move the initiatives forward. So when the evaluation of the program was being done and it was created, they looked at those the housing ecosystem, and some of it was driven by some of our partners and in the areas where they may have priorities.
Well, thank you so much, Lori. And we're going to move on to Janice Jones, Executive Director of Home, for the final presentation in this panel. So take it away, Janice.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you to Luke, Lori, and Alana for running this session. I have just a few slides, and I think it's going to be a lot of repetitiveness, simply because the data is overwhelming, and the information that we've seen, as well as our partners at Zillow and NAFA and the first panel and others, is that we are at a consensus point around the need to move the needle around Black home ownership. So real quickly, I'll just touch on who Home is. Home is the organization here within the greater Cincinnati who is charged with eliminating illegal discrimination in housing and promoting stable and integrated communities. Through that work, we do fair housing enforcement. We have a strong tenant advocacy arm. We do lots of education and outreach, research and advocacy, and we also have significant impacts in our Latinx communities. Next slide. The Fair Housing Act, you can see quickly the national protections, Ohio protections, and Cincinnati area protections. So when we talk about protected class, these are classes of individuals where there's been the determination that housing discrimination existed historically, and there needs to be decided and intentional action to reverse those patterns of historical discrimination. So race is, one of the key things that, caused the civil rights movement, and race is still with us today. Next slide. So Home's impact, we see about 3,000 clients a year that have housing crisis issue. These are people who call us and say, I'm having a problem with my housing, I'm being treated unfairly with my housing. We also do education for consumers and housing providers, and we also make policy recommendations to local jurisdictions. Next slide. COVID-19 fair housing and disparities. We are seeing the impact of COVID-19 in terms of those disparities. So the next crisis is unfortunately going to, we'll probably see the same type of issues, unfortunately, due to patterns of racial segregation and discrimination. What we're seeing currently are concerns around fair housing disparities around disability, race, sex discrimination, property management, and eviction. Next slide. So you've seen this map earlier, and again, Laurie did a great explanation of it, but I just can't show it enough in terms of redlining and the history of redlining. And I like to say sometimes we're talking about the descendants of redlining when we talk about some of these local and national issues that show up as disparity in home ownership. So that's that map again. Next slide. And from Housing Our Future, this may also look familiar in terms of the 40,000 unit deficit in Cincinnati with affordable housing. Again, I like to say clearly there's a deep bench of data and information that supports the need to take real intentional action to promote home ownership. And that's just another factor. Next slide. So we've talked about Black home ownership in Cincinnati. And again, this is just a recreation of an earlier slide. Again, we've come to the agreement, or I think the data is in agreement in terms of the disparities. And we see that in terms of white to Black wealth, not only here locally, but also nationally. Next slide. Okay, so this is the roadmap summary. I believe if you go into the expo part of the session, you can see the roadmap itself. And what the roadmap was designed to do, it started out as a white paper and is a working, living, breathing document that we hope will draw a light on some intentional actions we can take locally and we can advocate for with policymakers to improve Black home ownership in our area. So those are some of the key folks who were main contributors to the roadmap. It's designed to address harms, historical discrimination, and current calls for racial justice. We've received support from individuals and organizations. And again, it makes clear policy recommendations for elected officials and candidates. So this is something that our local elected officials hopefully will take a strong look at and consider ways that they can implement some of these policies. Next slide. So that's kind of teeny tiny. So you'll be able to see that in more in depth in the expo part of the presentation. But some of the key things that we believe will help improve Black home ownership in the greater Cincinnati is, first to modify the tax abatement incentives to bring parity between Black and white home ownership. We should create a fund to support home repairs and Black low-income homeowners, provide property tax relief for Black low-income homeowners, expand lending to Black and low-income home buyers. I think Luke and Lori did an excellent job in bringing attention to issues around credit scoring and the lack of traditional lending institutions in certain neighborhoods, as well as the disparity in things like home valuations and other things that we know lead to overwhelmingly to the lack of access to home ownership in Black communities, as well as loan products from lending institutions that particularly target these communities and are marketed affirmatively and aggressively to these communities as a way to access home ownership. We talked about density, the D word earlier. Again, modified zoning to be more inclusive. Exclusive zoning is one of those historical descendants of redlining. We say, that single family zoning initiatives were in part to keep some of those red lines in place. So bringing density to some of communities that have historically single family zoned will help to create greater access for Black home ownership and create independent and transparent monitoring of the process. So this is the standard, setting goals and objectives and monitoring progress and pivoting when changes need to be made, but knowing that there's a goal, here are the objectives, and here's what we're doing as a community to make sure that our public partnerships, our business community, and our elected officials are all rowing in the same direction when it comes to Black home ownership. Next slide. Again, the Biden administration has identified this as a key element of its administration. So again, this is an opportunity for local elected officials and policymakers to connect with the federal government on some initiatives that will increase Black home ownership. Next slide. So, this kind of is, just a general slide that says, the idea is that communities must affirmatively further fair housing, bring parity between Black and white home ownership, incentivize affordable housing, fund a housing trust fund where you're targeting folks at 30% of AMI, plan to combat nimbyism. Again, there was some discussion about that in the first session. NIMBYism is real. It is a barrier to Black home ownership. We know historically, and it's still with us today. Do more things to create eviction prevention. And so I think the tenant question also comes into the question of Black home ownership readily, because the idea that you have, these evictions, or you've had multiple evictions, or you've had a really rough and tumble affordability market is going to impact your ability in the future to access home ownership. So those are dings on the credit score. That's creating a family instability. That's creating, questions with people being able to maintain their jobs and having to move away from transportation. So I think that rolls up to the Black home ownership question when there's a high rate of eviction. And Black home ownership as its own goal: public policy, loans, appraisal, down payment assistance, alternative credit scoring, and tax policy. Next slide. Oh, and again, we have to always, because HOME is the Fair Housing Organization, and we are still doing direct service around the Civil Rights Initiative of 1968 to eliminate illegal discrimination in housing and promote stable, integrated communities. So you can become a fair housing tester to help test our market here in Cincinnati for those indices of illegal discrimination that are still happening today. Next slide. This is the final, next to last slide for me. Here's some resources. I think these slides will be made available to the group. Again, I will say that you can see the Fair Housing Assessment of 2019, as well as Housing Our Future 2020, which we borrowed heavily from for this presentation, and a lot of the work that was done to do those very in-depth and really data-driven studies are key in terms of making comprehensive housing policy that increases Black home ownership. Final slide. And if you're experiencing illegal discrimination in housing, that's our number. You can call our office and ask to speak to a housing specialist, and we will work with you to try to resolve your issues. And that is my final slide. Well, it appears that we've had some technical difficulties with Alana, and her connection's been lost. So I will just go back to our two presenters, Luke and Laurie, just to ask a couple more questions in terms of things. Oh, she's back.
Good. I was afraid you were going to ask us to sing a song or something.
Yeah, well, we were gonna go for it. We were gonna sing civil rights oldies but goodies from the civil rights era.
So I lost my connection for a moment, but I think we're at the point where. But I did want to ask you, Janice, what are the anticipated impact of the roadmap to Black homeownership?
Well, I think it has a lot of the indices that Laurie and Luke both indicated that would move the needle towards more Black home ownership. The study that Zillow sent, I remember when Luke sent it to me, and I kind of like emailed him a couple of times. Are you sure this is, is this right? We're third, the third worst in this study on home ownership. And, he even, made sure I got the link to the actual data itself. So I think that's, that I think with that level of urgency, as well as some of the tried and tested things that NAFA is working with in terms of their Keys Unlocked Dreams initiative, I think our roadmap is a good younger cousin of the Keys Unlocked Dream initiative, and some of the things that we've outlined in our roadmap clearly could fit into those buckets. So we just need the local public will to make it happen.
And my last question before we get some questions from our viewing audience here. So Janice, what are you looking for out of local policymakers in improving Black home ownership? And this is my favorite question because I know we have you policymakers here. So tell me what you need out of them.
Yeah, I think, we're in an election season right now here in greater Cincinnati area. And I think it's really important that the next generation of policymakers really look at the roadmap and the Fair Housing Assessment and the Housing Our Future initiative and the Keys Unlocked Dreams initiative and develop their plans for making those local, regional, national, public and private partnerships that help to bring parity to Black home ownership. I mean, the link to our future selves here in Cincinnati is strongly connected to wealth development and creation across generations, through the mid-century. So this is some mid-century moonshot thinking that needs to go into the next generation of public policy leaders if we want to remain competitively, not only in our region, but also on the global stage. I think there's strong, very clear indices around local and regional competitiveness, but also the global stage, national security. I mean, I think it touches a lot of different issues, no matter your political stripe, that, having this lag in wealth is not good for long-term longevity of a community.
Yeah, it doesn't make us look good for investment. It'll lead to brain drain. People don't want to invest in this community, don't want to move here, and we will lose people. And, some of the ideas for improving this, no matter how small, feel free to put your ideas on things you can do to improve the homeownership gap or to promote stable, integrated communities right there in the chat. And while you're in the chat, just tap there on the right to the polls. Only about 30 of you have taken our poll. So can we get 10 more? Take the poll and let us know in the chat something you can do personally, even if it's just being a great neighbor that you'll do to help improve not only the home ownership gap, but improving and promoting stable, integrated communities. So right now, do we have any questions in the chat ready for any of our panelists? And I'm checking on it as well. Someone said, Luke, you mentioned that home ownership is actually less of an economic burden than renting. The Urban Institute has also done work on this. Could you expand on this point, since most people think that month-to-month owning is more expensive? Oh, there it is. Yeah.
Absolutely. And thanks for the question. And we've actually done a few research reports on this as well. And the numbers bear out that, in fact, in many situations, home ownership can actually be a lot more affordable and less of an economic burden than renting. All of this, of course, depends upon making a leap from renting to home ownership, or from, frankly, other forms of housing insecurity like homelessness. Unless you have access to the capital and access to credit to able to afford the down payment requirement, closing costs, things of that nature, unfortunately, you're going to be locked out of accessing the benefits of home ownership versus renting, especially in an environment today that, even though, of course, home values nationwide, including and in Cincinnati, have went up considerably in the last 12 months, mortgage rates, of course, are almost near their lowest in history, which makes housing even more affordable, in those price points where folks can still afford housing than in the past. So it is important. It is definitely, in certain situations, much more affordable than renting. But as Janice and others mentioned, they don't have the resources to access home ownership without down payment assistance, without all those other things, where they're at a disadvantage, frankly, to white households.
And bringing up that point, that means we have a lot of people in the audience who work in mortgage lending who work in the various areas that could be educational, to present these options to people, and be role models in the community, as people who are stakeholders, and to bring the education out there. So that's great. We have from Rosalind, what is the impact of property taxes on the loss of Black home ownership in Cincinnati, and what can be done to preserve Black home ownership in an environment of gentrification? Who was that question for? Anyone on the panel? Whoever wants to answer that.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it. So I'd say overall the tax policy as an entity, whether you're talking about tax abatement, tax rates, modification of your tax rates, are negatively impacting home ownership. The tax abatement program in particular, we've seen some steep disparities between Black and white neighborhoods on one side of the spectrum. On the other side of the spectrum, it should never be a circumstance where it's merely a tax lien that's causing a homeowner to lose their home. So again, bringing parity to the tax abatement system, as well as creating equity in the tax delinquency enforcement system, I think will help keep individuals in their home as well as add value. There was a study done. There's been several done. There was a study done, around the tax system in Franklin County that I would say needs to also be done in Hamilton County in terms of the impact of the tax system and who's delinquent, how properties are valued, and the impact that is, and the disparities based on race.
Thank you so much. We have a question from Brady Melton. NIMBYism shows up today in many disguises as concerns that are not presented as racial issues. And for those who aren't aware, NIMBYism, not in my backyard, the opposition to certain programs and actions in your community. They show up as concerns not presented as racial issues. What suggestions do you have for persuading neighborhood residents that there is opportunity in diverse communities?
I can comment on this one. This is not uncommon at all. I've seen it here in my own community, unfortunately. But Dr. Tiffany Manuel from the Case Made, she has some really, really great insights on this in terms of how to communicate about affordable housing issues, that your average person is really just trying to get through their own family, their own day. They're trying to get their kids on the bus. So they have a hard time really seeing beyond what impacts just them in their little world. So making those communications be aspirational and to come at them with a more positive frame of mind, highlighting the benefits. So if XYZ happens, that means more funding for the schools, or, what are the positive impacts, to try to spin it in that way. Because I think as we've seen here, we can highlight the statistics, we can highlight data all day long, but changing hearts and minds is really, really much more challenging. You're dealing with people who have these attitudes really, really deeply entrenched. And so trying to work around that is incredibly challenging.
Well, I just want to, we have time for one more question. All right, one more question. Well, Al Rosser said, can anyone speak to how Cincinnati has historically spent property tax dollars only in the neighborhoods where they're generated, and how that has affected the blight of the infrastructures in different neighborhoods?
Yeah, I can talk about that generally. There is a deep question. I mean, if you notice in the roadmap, we talk about taxes two different ways on two different ends. So it definitely, the system of tax abatements, valuation, up and down the line, I think is critical to, preserving Black home ownership and encouraging Black home ownership in traditionally discriminated communities. So I think that that tax question is very topical, very important, and it's worth a study with a racial lens because there are disparities between neighborhoods like Indian Hill and the West End, where the tax burden is, the housing valuations are, vastly different, but the tax valuations, in terms of the tax bill, I mean, they're pretty similar. So I think the Port Authority did some research on that recently, as well as an op-ed that I wrote with some other partners that was in the Inquirer a few weeks ago. Where we talk about that specifically as a need for our county auditors and other officials to look at that system and determine whether or not there's equity and is there opportunity to increase Black home ownership, because we know there's a need and we know there's an affirmative responsibility to advocate for and implement policies that advance fair housing.
Yeah. Well, and people have noticed the disparity in where tax abatements are offered. And thank you, James, for remarking that, access to barriers to home ownership will be mentioned in upcoming panels. So I hope you will be staying in here for that. With that, I will go ahead and thank our panelists, Luke, Lori, and Janice. We'll be back at 11:30 a.m. for the keynote address. And in the meantime, feel free to visit the expo booths. Thank you so much.